delighted to be here and see everyone. And I hope I've got something that will be of interest to you all. I don't know. But the cryptic title, Becoming Punam and Other Stories, I hope will become clearer as I talk. And I'm really looking at this very curious thing that signifies leadership practices. And what I have to say is quite a sort of exotic location, still exotic to me, in Laos, PDR. Just a few words, if I may, by way of background. So I've got a chair in organisation studies, part-time at University of West of England, Bristol Business School, and also at James Cook University in North Queensland. I was former and founding director of the Bristol Centre for Leadership and interesting. Centre for Leadership and Organisational Ethics, now the what's it called, Bristol Leadership and Change Centre, still going, very active and interesting place. So my early career actually was in working for ICL. They sponsored my doctorate, and I was looking at mainframe computer installations, but from the kind of social context, or really, in a certain sense, the early concept of socio-materiality. So I was interested in social studies of science and technology, and some of the work of Woolgar and Latour and so on, Calon, that fed into my PhD work. I then was working with the NHS for a while. But then when I had a sort of checkered background, I spent time working as a musician in London, and also time as a meditation monk in a monastery for a few years. And then I took up an academic career and worked at what was Oxford Polytechnic, and Hillary's there. Hillary and I go way back because we became Oxford Brookes University, of course. And really, my work was largely in organisation studies and philosophy, really, and what became critical management studies. So it was a kind of really a scholarly career, largely. I had a lovely career time at Brookes, really enjoyed it. And then I moved to Exeter University, where I was at the Centre for Leadership Studies, which was my first kind of encounter with leadership. Even though I made it clear I didn't know anything about the subject, they still wanted me to go there. And I first encountered this curious concept of leadership. I published in organisation theory, leadership studies. But then I moved to Australia about more than a decade ago, and deliberately so, to this really fantastic university in Townsville in North Queensland, James Cook University. And there, long story, but I got caught up with development work, and quite quickly really got involved in working in Laos on a series of rural development projects. And then shortly after that, because of the work we were doing using participative action research there, through a network, I got invited to work with the Malaria Elimination Initiative, which is a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation-funded initiative. And I worked for many years in the Greater Mekong sub-region, Vietnam, and more recently in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Eswatini, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. Most recently, I've been working on HIV prevention and co-running a project there, which is Gates funded. But today, I'm not going to talk about that work. I'm going to go back to some of my early field notes from my work in Laos. I'm going to kick off with some ontological and epistemological assumptions, and just to sort of let you know where I'm kind of coming from intellectually with this. And then I'm going to use this framework, leadership as practice, which is part of a practice term. Strategy is practice. There's a big practice term in organisation studies. And in leadership, this is the version, leadership as practice. And apply that to interpreting the field work that I did in the early days. And I'm going to talk about 3 stages of my own learning journey, if you like, through through this curious world that I encountered in Laos. And then, sort of towards the end, look at some of the complexities ethically of engaging in the kind of work I do, and drawing some conclusions, and hope, to leave time for discussion. I welcome engagement with you on this. So I want to start out. For years, I kind of masked the fact that I'm really interested in Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, and I would dress my work up in French post-structuralism or process philosophy. But these days, because I'm getting older, I just think, well, what the hell? I'm just going to say what I'm actually interested in. So I am definitely coming at this from a Buddhist perspective, sort of intellectually and emotionally. And it's apposite, I think, because I am talking about Laos, and Laos is religiously a Buddhist country. It's Theravada Buddhism, predominantly in that region, Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. And so this is a quote that I rather like from one of my favourite suttas within the Theravada Pali Canon. And it's the Buddha in a sutta saying, in this world, substance is seen in what is insubstantial. Sentient creatures are tied to their psychophysical beings, and so they think that there is some substance, some reality in them. But whatever be the phenomenon through which they think of seeking their self-identity, it turns out to be transitory. It becomes false. But what lasts for a moment is deceptive. The state that is not deceptive is nirvana. That's the Pali's nirvana is the Sanskrit. With this insight into reality, their hunger ends. Cessation, total calm. Why is this relevant? Well, what I'm going to be talking about are concepts of agency and power. And so this means that we are dealing with a particular realm, as it would be seen through Buddhist philosophy. It's the realm of conventional truth, Vihara Satya. It relates to consensus reality as socially conditioned and linguistically mediated. So in this realm of truth, then sure, we exist, we have self-consciousness, self-reflexivity, we consider ourselves to be, and so forth. But if one turns one's attention, and the means to do this is through meditation, to ultimate truths, Paramatta Dhamma, then we start to look at the actual phenomenological components of what consciousness is, how consciousness is created, what are the elements. And if you look at that, then you discover that everything is so transient that the conventional world that we experience, of this space, of beings in it, and so on, doesn't obtain. Philosophically, it just does not obtain. If you look at it closely, it disappears in a certain sense. So this I would see as a true philosophical process ontology. Now, when people in, say, leadership as practice theory talk about process, from my point of view, it's not. They might say process ontology, but actually they're operating in this domain still. Albeit, of course, it's a philosophical discourse within the conventional one, but it's still, as I see it, a discourse. And it is, of course, trying to get beneath the common sense, everyday assumptions we make about things like leadership, process, and so forth. They're trying to look at the process at a deeper level. But from my point of view, and this is important, it's still there. It's not, from my point of view, philosophically, a process ontology. So that's where I'm coming from. Another concept that's important to me is the notion of linguistic relativity. And I've chosen a quote from Peter Buckley and Malcolm Chapman's work, published in Journal of Management Studies in '97. I can't remember the title of the piece, but I know Malcolm well. He studied with Edwin Arden at Oxford. I met him there many years ago. And so he's coming at studies of organisation from an anthropological point of view. And Buckley and Chapman say a social anthropologist would typically take the view that every society, however defined, had its own specific words and categories, which were at every level socially derived and mediated. It can, from this perspective, be no guarantee that words and categories will be congruent from one society to the next. And that's certainly been my experience gradually as I acquired the language in Laos. And in the work I'm going to describe, actually, I'm going back to a pre-linguistic point, that, you know, the terms that we use routinely in the English language, you know, the categories are they're different, and you have to kind of immerse yourself in that to really begin to appreciate that difference. And I think it's almost impossible, actually, really, truly, to kind of get to meaning as it's understood locally, but you can get reasonably close, I would say. Another concept that's important, and these are generic things, obviously, that I'm talking about here, is the notion, again, drawing from linguistics and anthropology, the difference between emic operation and etic operations. And emic operations have as their hallmark the elevation of the native informant, that's as it was framed in 1979, to the status of ultimate judge of the adequacy of the observer's description and analyses. Whereas etic operations, in contrast, elevate the observer to the status of judge of the concepts and categories employed. So this is really where you get into issues around ethnocentricity, of, you know, from the etic point of view, dangers of projecting onto a given cultural context meanings that you're bringing in as in my case, a white Western male coming into a space. And I think in the work I've done with my colleagues, we've actually tried wherever possible to kind of fulfill the conditions of emic operation. I've tried to, particularly where we've done linguistic work, of actually exploring with people in the field, college farmers, for example, professionals we've worked with, the particular meanings of terms, in this case around leadership, the constellation of words, which in Lao relate to broadly to this phenomenon. Okay, so a little bit more theory, and then we'll get into the meat of the data. So I have to say that, well, I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So I've been working on my early field notes with a colleague at Durham University now, Martina Sliwa. I'll say a bit more about how we co-constructed our ethnography in a moment. But we alighted upon leadership as practice as a helpful way of interpreting the outcome of our collaboration and exchange. Why? It's a relatively new kind of, I guess, innovation in the leadership studies field. And what's interesting is it's looking at leadership from a socio-material point of view. So not, again, sort of, you can see echoes here of actor network theory, the kinds of work that I was into when I was doing my PhD, which is looking at the way in which the social collapses into the material and vice versa. You know, it's very, very hard to kind of draw hard and fast distinctions between, you know, the material world that we inhabit and the social. So, you know, this notion of social materiality, I think, is quite helpful in interpretatively. So, specifically, I want to develop an understanding using this LAP perspective of learning. So there are various kind of lacunae in the literature of LAP around learning, around agency, and around power. Now, LAP, you know, in its sort of strongest form, you know, the notion of the individual sort of, because it's, you know, it's kind of ideologically trying to move into a post-heroic space in respect to leadership, to, you know, kind of decenter the person in leadership. And, you know, there's a scale and spectrum along which, you know, different studies fall. But, you know, for reasons that I'll go on to explain, in a sense, I wanted to recover the role of agency in relation to LAP. I think in a certain sense, I'd say within leadership studies, the sort of pendulum has swung too far the other way, and you're not paying now sufficient attention to agency move power moves and so forth. So I wanted to kind of address that. And in the literature, as I read it, there wasn't kind of a denial of self-reflexivity or self-consciousness of deliberation. And therefore, I think I tried to license myself to inquire into experiences of leadership and leadership learning at this individual level. You know, the individual, you know, it's based on embodied socio-material and experiential processes that involve observation and experimentation. So this is all part of, you know, trying to license the space in which to write. And Krivani and Endrasat, who are kind of part of the, you know, important group of people writing about LAP, characterize it as producing direction for organizational processes, reorientation of the flow of practice, and the emergent co-construction through collaborative agency. So what the work I'm reporting here tries to do is to address the calls in the literature for closer examination of learning agency and power. Margaret Collinson, now sadly no longer with us, was one of the voices calling for that. Steve Kempster at Lancaster. And the main protagonist in this area is Joe Raylin, who's, I think, probably the closest thing in the States to a kind of leadership guru, I suppose. And so responding also in this work to Steve Kempster's call for strong commitment to conducting empirical work, despite its time-consuming, expensive and uncertain nature, rather than engagement with yet more conceptual critiques and polemic propositions. And it's true, if you look at the LAP literature, it is highly conceptual often. There is very little empirical work. I think Olakowski's work and Barbara Simpson on the notions of entanglement are also important. So the entanglement of the social and the material in production of what Kempster and Harry call leadership effect, that acknowledges the constant dynamics of how people in space interact. So much for, so I hope that's kind of given you a notion of sort of where I'm coming from philosophically and also theoretically, the sort of setup for interpreting the framework. So just a few acknowledgements before I launch into this. So the work I'm reporting on was funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, and I'm concentrating here on 3 projects that we had going there. There was a subsequent project as well, which doesn't form part of this. I really want to acknowledge Martina Sleever's contribution, because I think I was struggling really to know what to do, particularly with this early field work. I tried to get it published and as kind of ethnographic work without success. But Martina kind of prompted me to work with it, and she worked with me. And it was almost, I would say, sort of quasi-therapeutic process of going through these notes, of taking me back into the field in terms of mental theatre. It was kind of almost 3D Technicolor experience, and sort of reliving it and helping me interpret it. And it's probably took over a year of dialogue, not every week, but every other week we would have an hour or 2 of conversation. And through that, co-constructed an ethnography. Other people that I would like to acknowledge, Somsai Sisano, who was a senior person in the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in Laos, who was really very important in supporting the work. Campbell Kusombat was also another civil servant who was really important to the work. My colleagues, John Connell, who is an adjunct at James Cook University, Michael Jones, who was a field worker in Laos when we met, employed him, is now my doctoral student, my last doctoral student, I think. I'm hoping will complete soon. And Natalie Sturcall was a professor of development economics at JCU, and Simon Fong, an anthropologist. All of these people have been involved in this project work. This early phase, apart from Martina, I'm not acknowledging as a collaborator more recently. So Lao PDR, can I ask, has anyone been to Laos? No one. So I can say whatever I like.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's good to know. No one can challenge me. I can make it up as I go along. So it's really a gem, and I encourage anyone here to go. It's between Vietnam, lies between Vietnam, China to the north, Myanmar here, and Thailand. And Cambodia to the south, of course. And it was created by the French. I mean, it didn't exist. The nation states didn't exist in that region until the French came along in the 1890s and carved it up, basically. And they colonized Vietnam first, and then through a mapping exercise, gradually took over this region and then put the border basically down the length of the Mekong in this Laos. So it has a French colonial history, part French Indochina. Thailand, of course, managed to stay clear of any colonial intervention because the British were in Burma, of course, up here, and they kind of acted as a buffer zone. Anyway, so there's a very long history to Laos. I mean, there's anthropological studies that kind of look at the ethnic diversity and ethnic patterns going back millennia, essentially. So there's a long history here. Because really we're looking at very recent history with the French intervention. And of course it was hugely impacted by what the Lao and the Vietnamese call the American War. I could speak a great deal about that, but I shan't today. So it's landlocked, it's very mountainous here, this border with Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, of course, famously right down that chain of mountains. It's, as a result of French colonization, it has 17 provinces and 144 districts. Population, the latest data I could get, 7.3 million. It's a single party democratic socialist state run by the Lao People's Revolutionary Party. It's a Marxist-Leninist inspired government, close to the former Soviet Union politically and funded largely by them. This started in '75 when the communists won over the monarchists, and it was very bloody, of course, part of the war, but the final move was bloodless as the party took over in '75. And it became very, very insular as a country for a long period of time, up until about '86 with perestroika. It started to open up. It wasn't as brutal a regime as Cambodia, but there were some pretty nasty things that went on. 80% of the population is still engaged in agriculture, 52% smallholder subsistence farmers, and a significant part of GDP is based in agriculture. Huge problems there. Raising tax revenue is very difficult. There's a lot of dependence on official development assistance and direct foreign investment. More recently, the last decade, they've got into huge debt with the Chinese government, funding all kinds of things. I'm hesitant about use of the word corruption because I think it's a very loaded term, and there's a huge danger of ethnocentrism in applying the notion of corruption. But there certainly are self-serving people in Laos that the people of Laos would recognise as self-serving, and deals are struck which are not advantageous to the people, I would argue. Okay, so on to the early work I did in Laos. So just a bit more of context. So this was one of the first photos I took. Inspiring, isn't it? So you're wondering what on earth's pictured here? Well, what's pictured? This is kind of fairly remote place in northern Thailand, and this is a kind of outpost. What are called district agriculture and forestry offices, these are places are populated by professionals whose job it is to help advise smallholder farmers on their practices and farming practices. And here is piled up a whole bunch of remaindered water pumps. And these come from previous irrigation projects. So typically, an external donor like Luxembourg Development comes in, as a 3-year project, wouldn't it be good if we got some irrigation going here to help the farmers grow their crops? So they come in with their teams and they install these elaborate irrigation systems. And then they break down. After 3 years, the project's over, everyone leaves, all the external advisors leave, and the farmers are left with the machinery. But they can't fix it. So when it goes wrong, what do? Well, we better take it back to the DAFO office, and that's exactly what they've done here, right? They've taken it back and they've just dumped it outside of the office. So the impetus behind the work I was doing with these colleagues from James Cook University was to try and do something a bit more sustainable, to kind of make an intervention that wouldn't result in this kind of remaindering, for example, and something that would be much more lasting in its impact. So I've mentioned it's the livelihoods are agricultural based. There's still swidden farming, shifting cultivation present in certain parts of the mountainous regions. It's massively ethnically diverse. The dominant group is the Lao Lun. They dominate politically, socially, and linguistically. So 70% of people roughly speak Lao, a Lao Lun language is Lao. Basically, it's a form of Isan Thai. It's a Thai language. But there are, according to some linguists, there are 5 groups of languages. And according to some linguists, depending on how you look at it, they argue there's 120 different languages based in Laos. It's a little bit like Papua New Guinea, because you've got these mountainous regions, and you literally get different languages in different villages. You know, it's quite bewildering, actually. And I went to a talk some years ago by Nick Enfield, who's kind of like the preeminent Thai Lao or Thai language linguist and as an expert on Laos, who says he thinks there are still undiscovered languages in Laos now, which is quite, to me, quite mind-blowing. So there's a great deal of poverty still. I think it's just come off the list of the most poor, but it was certainly on the WHO, on the United Nations list of one of the most poorest countries in the world. One of the poorest countries in the world. So just to frame the context of my ethnographic work, so there was a practical dimension to what we were doing. We were commissioned by ASEA and working in collaboration with the Lao government to assist the Lao Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry with improvements to the management and delivery of state agriculture extension services. So these are the services, I showed you that district agriculture and forestry office there. So provincial agriculture and forestry office, there's a kind of network of support to farmers. Now, historically, the professionals occupying roles there would be, they probably would have had some education in agriculture. They would advise farmers on technical aspects of, choices of rice varieties to plant, use of pesticides and fertilizers and so on. But on a very piecemeal basis, they go out, they talk to a few farmers in this village. It didn't really join up. So the idea is, the conceit, if you like, that we had was that we could change the way in which these professionals who were working with the farmers went about things, make it much more facilitative as a role, and as it turns out, to give much more autonomy and space for farmers to self-organize around commercialization of crops. So, basically helping farmers to bulk their goods, and in so doing, to get better prices from dealers and to increase the household incomes. And it was part of then strategy to meet the Millennium Development Goals around poverty eradication. I mean, it did make some, they have made advances, but of course poverty is still a big problem there. So the objective is to develop an integrated extension management system for use in 2 pilot provinces and 4 districts. So sharing of best practices to help think much more strategically about crops in a particular area. And there were also systems of monitoring and reporting which just weren't there before. And you say, well, this looks terribly managerialist, but actually it was very important in terms of really trying to battle the forces that were quite negative around monocropping, around wage labour, so which would completely shift the way in which villages are organised and people live their lives in the rural community. So there was kind of, there still are dark forces. So this process of accountability actually was significant politically in terms of making the case for subsistence farming, you know, in a new form, if you like, in an evolved form. Anyway, I'm talking far too much about that. To identify mechanisms and processes for upscaling these tools nationwide, and you know, to shift government thinking around this, and to break free of this project, this cultural project dependence. Okay, so doing this kind of work is fraught ethically, I'd say, particularly using participatory action research methodology at these various levels. You know, obviously there are differing stakeholder priorities and motives, relative power relations, different subject positions. There's the whole politics of surveying, using surveying technologies, the macro political placement, the intervention, and of course, you know, working in this post-colonial context, it itself raises issues, I think. The photos here, this tobacco farm is actually one afternoon sitting on the banks of the Mekong River. And this was a repatriation ceremony that we were kind of drawn into. So it's body repatriation on the borders of Vietnam. This is some years ago, and 3 of my colleagues were enrolled because they were members of the party and would have been significant figures, you know, in this particular village from the point of view of authorities that they got involved in that process. Here's me. A lot of our meetings with farmers took place in temples, vaults. These are not just used for religious purposes; they're used for, you know, for community purposes, community meetings, and so on. So what I'm reporting on was a lot of ethnographic observation, 12 field trips in this period, 2012 to 16. In terms of the project, there were literally hundreds of interviews with farmers and government staff, and we did participatory action workshops and focus groups with a large number of people. I kept research diaries, which is largely what I'm going to be speaking about today. This co-constructed autoethnography that I worked on with Martina, based on my research diaries. And as I say, I'm going back in this particular instance to some very early build. Just a little bit about the language. I'm not going to focus on language. I've written another paper with colleagues about linguistic aspects of leadership. But there is no equivalent to the English now leadership, as there is no equivalent in French, for example. So it's kind of an odd term, actually, leadership. Equivalents and approximations for the English word leader. Well, this term, kunam, which I am going to focus on, is probably the closest direct translation, but there are other terms like kunamna, husinam, which are more descriptive. They kind of, these are terms like that say, well, this is about getting someone to follow you. So there's a kind of, if you like, broadly speaking, a followership dimension to this, whereas this is a kind of very person-centric notion of leader. There are another constellation of terms around this. Naiban, village head, Wana is a generic term for boss. Jarwan, district governor. This has a really ancient history, this term. These terms, Juawan, Jarwan, these are terms that date back to the Mandala states, way before colonialism, like millennia. These terms have been around. Terms for. And the important thing is, Neo-Homban and village elders, but the important thing to note here is that the party has appropriated all of these terms, right? So so I've got this kind of verbatim from a senior party member. There is no leadership outside, and there are no leaders outside of the party. So it's hard to imagine. But we're talking about a kind of hegemony which is really quite extraordinary. So it goes from the Politburo through the ministries out to right down to the level of village heads. So a village head of a village will be a party member, and so on. So there is no kind of escaping the party, right? And that's an important notion to get. Village elves too, would all be party members. So there's this sort of sense of containment, really, that you get certainly when you talk to villagers about these terms. I haven't time to go into that today, but it's really fascinating. So what I do want to talk about is, and I will do this in about 15 minutes, is 3 stages that I personally went through when I first landed up there in this very curious place, not speaking a word of the language, and trying to make sense of what was going on. So my first attempts at understanding leadership practice, and of course this is an ethic notion because I'm going in as a Westerner in terms of leadership, and then learning to influence the leadership practices, and then finally purposefully participating in leadership practices. Okay, so if I may, I'm going to revert to my notes because I think with ethnography, it's actually in the representation, the writing, so I'm going to, if you'll indulge me, read some of the interpretations. So this first image, it's doing its own thing here. This. No idea why it let that start. Right, so this is the lone Punam. Punam is a term, as I've already mentioned, which is the best direct translation of leader, but it does refer to party leadership. Only party members would be acknowledged. And this is a senior civil servant who's chairing a meeting in a provincial agriculture and forestry office. So my initial learning about leadership practice in the context of the Laos project took place through gaining an understanding of which human and non-human participants contributed to leadership practice and how they contributed to the emergence of leadership. Aware that organizational space communicates power in organizations and reflects and performs social relations, I quickly realized that the spatial arrangement of formal meetings, and I should point out that I'm only concerned today with formal meetings, not all the meetings that happened in villages, in cafes and drinking sessions with party members, not dealing with that today. It's just these formal meetings. I realized that the spatial arrangement of formal meetings played a key role in establishing and reproducing the hierarchical political dynamics within the project. In particular, participant action research workshops, which tended to be medium-sized gatherings involving 20 to 30 participants, and taking place in local government buildings and hotels in the pilot study provinces, as well as project team meetings, offered opportunities to learn about what Arya Wopu and Per Salvala terms spacing leadership in the local context. So also introducing elements from the co-constructed ethnography, and to promote both the major workshops and the smaller gatherings followed similar kinds of protocols and forms of authority display, regardless of whether they were convened in an official building or a hotel. Room and seating configuration during the major workshops was standardized. The typical room layout comprised long hardwood teak tables and chairs arranged in 2 or 3 parallel rows running the length of the room, with a table running crosswise at one end, at which the Punam, the highest ranking officially recognized leader, presided for key parts of the proceedings. Typically there were flowers, quite often fake ones, on the desks. In addition to the flowers, the room in which a given workshop or meeting took place was typically adorned with artifacts that carried specific symbolic meanings and set the tone for the meeting. For example, directly behind the Punam's chair, so it's cross tabletop, is this bust on both sides, so here and over here would be flags. One's the Communist Party hammer and sickle, which you can see there, and then the next to that would be the Lao national flag. Further, the meeting would always take place in the symbolic presence of caisson Pombehan, who was the leader of the Laos People's Revolutionary Party from 1955 onwards. He was the first Prime Minister of Laos and the first President, whose bust would have been located in a visible place in the room. So this is plinth here at the back. They tried to kind of create a kind of cult around Khe Sanh, a bit like Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong in Vietnam and China respectively, but it didn't really take off. But he's still around, he's still there in every meeting. The two flags, as well as the bust of Khe Sanh Pombehan, signalled the embeddedness of the meeting and more broadly the leadership practice within the political structures of Laos People's Democratic Republic and the government's agenda. The meanings of the political symbols infused the space in which leadership was emerging and communicated the omnipresence of political structures that both constrained and contained leadership practice. The presence of the political symbols in meeting rooms also communicated and reinforced the superior importance within the leadership practice of those participants with the highest rank within the Communist Party. Learning to decipher the meanings behind the politicization of meeting spaces was key to understanding how leadership is locally constituted. And it allowed me a Falang. I was a foreigner. Falang is a corruption of foreigner. Falang, an outsider, to gain greater understanding of how I might go about trying to exercise agency in this very different cultural context. In the workshops and meetings, the presence of symbolic artifacts was coupled with a purposeful arrangement of participants in the room. This arrangement of who was located where signalled the hierarchical ranking of each person in the room. So your position in the room kind of linked you, positioned you, and kind of said who you were, if you like, spatially. As well as spatially configuring interaction between participants. So the workshop participants were seated along tables. Seats at the inner tables, these here, were reserved for more senior members of staff, for example, provincial heads, district heads, and so on, whereas the outer tables were occupied by more junior staff. As Vivian Sergi explains, human actors formally identified as leaders can have a decisive influence in meetings, including the power to impose decisions. In the case of the Lao project, I learned that the spatial location of the human participants communicated the extent of their mandate to exercise agency and influence during a meeting. I also came to understand that the spatial location of participants was granting them differing degrees of freedom within the proceedings. During the early stages of my project, my physical location, surprise, surprise, was on the outer tables, and it precluded me from participating for the most part. So occasionally I'd get called up, typically at the beginning, and because I was the person holding the money, I'd kind of be introduced, but then I was relegated to sort of this area over here. I also learned early on about the importance of another aspect of leadership practice, namely the routine protocols according to which workshops proceeded. These included, and bear in mind, I don't speak the language, so this is all happening, and I don't understand a word. So actually what that did was give me a much greater kind of acuity and sensibility to these very things, to the space, to the symbolic stuff that was going on. Because, you know, I couldn't help myself and my conditioning as a social scientist. That was what I was tuning into in the absence of understanding what was going on linguistically. So I learned about the importance of these protocols. These included an opening speech by the most senior person or persons present, a prosaic outline of the workshop purpose and program, formal discussions chaired by the most senior official present at the time, with open discussions typically being preceded by contributions from the floor that were taken in order of seniority, provincial heads followed by district heads, and a closing process which entailed a summary of the key elements of the program and relating an official version of what had been achieved. Oh, you're joking. Oh, good Lord. I'm not sure I can do that, Simon.
Okay.
Forgive me.
You'll be creeping a little into your question time. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to creep a little longer. I'll have to align some of the stuff at the end.
Yeah.
Okay. So the official version of what was achieved was fascinating. It was kind of pretty tedious, even when I started to understand it. And closing speeches by the most senior staff present. Such protocols exemplify what Barbara Simpson describes as practices, specific sequences of activities or routines, which may be invoked repeatedly to simplify day-to-day experience and which are valued for their routine. The temporal sequence of the protocol simultaneously gave voice to some participants and suppressed the voices of others. In this initial stage of learning and participation, I observed how leadership emerged as a collective socio-material accomplishment and so on. Maybe I can align some of this. So basically, I'm drawing the conclusion that if I want to kind of participate here and exercise agency, I have to change the way I'm doing things. Pretty sure. So the second stage of learning was how I might influence the process. So in the co-constructed autoethnography, I say brazenly, I wanted to assert power, not as a kind of ego trip, but to be able to accomplish the pragmatic aims of the project as I saw it, and in order to be taken seriously. Otherwise it'd be completely bypassed by this. So otherwise the day-to-day project activities and intended practical outcomes could have been significantly compromised. As such, my underlying intentions were geared towards improving the chances of project success, and the motives underlying these intentions, in turn, were premised on an ethical assessment of the overall worth and likely positive effects on smallholder well-being of the project interventions. Based on my learning in the initial phases, I was aware of how exercising influence was enabled by the materiality of the leadership practice, in particular the meeting room layout, positioning of the chairs and discussion at the discussion table. I knew that sitting on a chair situated at the head of the table would afford me the possibility of speaking in meetings and to have my voice heard as someone who others in the room would perceive as possessing legitimate authority. So again, aligning some of this. So I learned to occupy a chair at the head of the table. Obviously I had to get permission to do that. I couldn't just do it, but I got permission from the Puna to do that. And typically I would be, so some of the first things I learned in Laos were how to introduce myself, talk about my status, my role, to kind of frame things, to authorize my voice. And then similarly at closings, I'd be given space to talk. So it was all about establishing credibility and authority. And I think I elide a lot of this. So yeah, I've already made this point. I had to pay a lot of attention to the extra linguistic practices in the beginning. So eventually, after all these observations and kind of attending many, many meetings of this sort, eventually all these efforts at developing an understanding of how the assemblage of humans and non-humans create leadership effects in the Lao context, together with conscious experimentation and modification of my own position within that configuration, led to my feeling that I was beginning to gain greater visibility and influence. I observed, for example, that other people began to build on my moves through note-taking, which was really significant. So, the staff would judiciously take notes when a senior person talked, and that started to happen when I spoke, gradually. I'm talking, we're sort of at least 2 years into the project by this stage. Okay, so this then eventually led to a point where so this is another picture of a Puna addressing a group. Eventually led to a point where I could start to be much more purposeful about my intervention. So during a field trip that took place at the end of year 2 of the project, it was necessary for me to chair a meeting, so I was sanctioned to chair it. And at this point, my role in proceedings had been, up until that point, my role in proceedings had been more or less ceremonial. But here I had an opportunity to actually start to engage. So I convened the meeting of a group comprising district heads. So these would all be LRP members, heads of districts, and we were discussing the agricultural extension management system. Aware of the significance of the meeting for the prospects of the expanding this system, in sharing the meeting, I made efforts purposefully to influence what happened during specific episodes by impacting the orientation of the meeting and thus reflecting my understanding of collectively agreed objectives. I sat at the top of the table. I've tried to mask identities here, but I was at the top of the table. To my right was my colleague John, who was also on the project team and a fluent now speaker who was translating at this point. In preparation for the meeting, which took place in a hotel, I deliberately configured the room and chair placement to replicate that of the many other formal meetings in Laos I'd attended and observed. Furthermore, as I'd come to learn, I began the meeting with a resolute sounding motivational speech, which in line with party rhetoric made reference to the 7th Party Congress proclamations, extolling the virtues and importance of the work we were doing for the people of Laos, and emphasising the crucial role to be played by district heads in achieving our collective objectives of improving smallholder livelihoods. I used a forceful, authoritative tone of voice, devoid of humour, of the sort I'd heard other Lao leaders employ for this kind of rousing talk. And I have to say there was nothing disingenuous about this. I was kind of going native on this, I would say. It was actually, I was quite happy with the rhetoric, and happy to kind of make that kind of speech. The discussion followed an agenda, and I prepared first in English and then asked one of the bilingual in-country project team members to translate the distribution to allow members of the meeting. Okay, there's a lot more I could say about the meeting and how that kind of how that evolved. And I have lots of concluding points as well, which I probably don't have time to deal with. But you've probably got a sense of what this is about. Okay. Now this year, we had an exchange with Joe Raylin, who's kind of like, I suppose, well, he's certainly one of the founding figures of leadership as practice theory. And I think he took issue with some of the work here, because some of this doesn't fit, I think, with his own ideological view about what LAP should be about. So Martina and I had an exchange which we wrote quite flatteringly, wrote a whole paper on our paper, and then asked us to respond, which we did. So that's all published. But just to say, that so one of the points that Joe raised is like, for the ideal of LAP is the formation of community within which members, through social critique, may be able to resist oppression and other forms of inequitable social arrangements. Well, you can't do that. That might be your ideal, but if you're dealing with the formal end of things, as I learned at my cost, you get put down. You're silenced very quickly and publicly. So, there's no way of overtly challenging it. But what I would say is that if you can get, and this is true also the work I've done in Zimbabwe, if you can get the sort of formal authorization to do the work through these compliance with authority, then that open up degrees of freedom. And I would say that we were quite successful in doing that, and then working with farmers and also the professionals in a much more kind of open way, which was much more about kind of listening to voices and affording people on the ground space to organize differently. So there was a kind of possibility of quiet activism. I should say also that this all has to do with party and different factions in the party, and the guy we were working with, Somsai Sisanon, was definitely open to this kind of possibility. I could say a lot more, but I shouldn't, because I should give you time to ask questions. But anyway, there was kind of an ethical debate with Joe about our positioning in the paper and so on. And he made accusations of managerialism, which we rebutted. I'm just going to flip through. I'm not going to conclude because I haven't got time. And what I'm going to just leave up here is, so I did a ref case study, and I went back out in 2020 to do a kind of impact evaluation, work with the ministry, and part of a long. We did an evaluation course at the time, and what we conservatively thought were the outcomes. And so I'll leave you to that, and I'm just going to open up to questions. And I don't know, do you want me to chair this?
No, I'll chair. I don't trust you. I've seen your time, Peter.
I'll take up too much time. But thank you. Sorry to run over so much.
Thank you, Peter. That's great. So open it up now to questions, observations, impertinent interjections, whatever you feel like doing. Wave at me and I'll point at you. Please introduce yourself so we can start to all understand who everybody is, particularly given we've got a number of externals here. So anybody for anyone? Go ahead, Hilary.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's a really fascinating case, and I'd like to sort of correspond with you maybe because we did a related case working in Kenya with Farm Shop, which was an agricultural franchise organisation, social enterprise, which had fairly similar aims actually. We did a kind of ethnographic study of what was happening there. One of the things I was going to ask you is what we found from some of our research is that what we went in to observe, which was we were funded to evaluate the leadership, but the funders wanted to know whether or not their money was being well spent based on how the leadership and management of the organisation was kind of unfolding. And what we found when we spoke to the kind of franchisees who were the kind of smallholder farmer representatives was that the leadership wasn't really happening in the places that we thought it was happening. So we assumed that the kind of management of Farm Shop, the management team, the senior managers were going to be the key leads in communities and in the district and through the business, the operation of the business. But what we found is that the people that were working as the franchisee shop holders were engaging in all kinds of leadership practices which were outside the scope of business. So they were, identifying ways to fund local children through schools, they were fundraising, they were setting up electoral stations in their region, they were trying to create greater levels of equality for women in the local community through a whole range of interventions. And for us, that was the most fascinating part of the study. In the end, sat outside, in a way, the scope of the observation, which was the leadership team, seemed to us to be become somewhat irrelevant to fantastic change which was happening through processes that sat outside formal leadership systems. I don't know if you found anything similar.
Very similar, very similar. Just out of interest, were those activities that you're talking about, were they kind of drawing on your project funds, or were they just, no, wasn't
No, they were kind of happening as a result of the establishment of the farm shops.
Yeah.
Those shops
So
had their life outside of the...
Absolutely. Yeah, so that was absolutely key to what was going on here, and sort of part of the design, and it worked particularly well in a province called Chengquan and a district called Kuan in northern, it's near the border, fairly near the border with Vietnam and northern Laos. And what we kind of capitalized on there, if you like, was some very small scale experimentation that had happened with organic farming. But working with some very, two women in particular who were brilliant, who really kind of got the concept of what through our conceit we were trying to do. And they ran with that ball and got the idea that you, rather than sort of instructing farmers, which was the kind of, didactic approach, we'd actually work with the farmers, take them to buyers and so forth. And once I'm talking like here, probably 4 years into the project at this stage, 3 or 4 years, once the farmers themselves kind of we've got these opportunities, then it just massively kind of blossomed, and it just took on a life of its own, quite outside of anything that we were doing. So it was a kind of catalytic series of moments over the first few years, and then suddenly it took on a the self-organizing principle took over, and it just did its own thing right out of our hands. So yeah, I recognise that you get all maybe expected, maybe unexpected consequences. I think in this sense, in this case, we kind of hoped it would happen, and it actually has generated. It's one of the success stories. A whole new organic coffee growing region in Laos that didn't exist before. So.
Any more for any more at this point? Go ahead, Joanna.
Hi. I was really interested when you were talking about observing in a language you didn't understand.
Sorry, I missed that.
Sorry, I was very interested to hear what you said about listening and observing in a language you didn't understand.
Yeah.
And part of my research has been around capturing oral stories and oral storytelling. The work of Tambuku I found really interesting around rhythm analysis, where she's listened to transcripts in a language she didn't understand, but I think she speaks about 4 or 5 different languages.
Yeah.
But she was listening to the emotive sounds and stories and how that communicated, and it took away the content, and it's something I'm covering in my presentation today. So you looked at the other context of what was happening rather than just focusing on the content. And I don't know whether that's particularly a Western trait of our research and what we do, but I'm interested to hear your comments if you've got some further observations on that. But I found that sort of resonated with the work that I'm doing.
Certainly, I definitely relate to that, and yeah, I mean, tone of voice. I mean, I picked up on a lot of stuff that I think was going on, and obviously it's my inference. So strictly speaking, none of this is emic, right? I haven't gone back and I haven't had conversations with Lao colleagues about this. Other aspects of our work probably was, but certainly linguistically, when we were looking at terminology, we did discuss that. For example, farmers. I mean, farmers, for example, were incredibly reluctant to be called, to have leadership, the term leader applied to them, even though in terms of, like the explanandum, there definitely was something happening in those groups, and you kind of tell that there was leadership happening, and particular individuals championing stuff, but they really wouldn't want that appellation. So I'm kind of going off the subject a bit, but certainly, so in this initial work, I'm just sitting in a room, observing and trying to discern what I can from things like the tone, the actual protocols, the turn taking, all those things are kind of evident, who's speaking when, and then obviously lots of inference. Now, as time went by, of course, and there was more exposure, I started to confirm or disconfirm inferences that I was making. But certainly, and so yeah, when it came to like that year 2 speech, I was mimicking. It was a process of mimicking, right? I knew that. And obviously there was some partial translation of proceedings as well. It was party 2. But I would, took on the party rhetoric deliberately. I knew that was, and this was all part of. It wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't about. It wasn't narcissistic. I would say. Like I would say that, wouldn't I? But I don't. it wasn't. I wasn't like. In one sense, I didn't care. Whether I was influential or not, but I thought it was my responsibility to do this, and so I was trying to do the best I could with it, and making the other people feel comfortable about it, because that's what they would have expected in that space at that time, and tone of voice and all of that. That had been learned from that initial year and a half, just looking at stuff. Yeah, but I recognise what you're saying. Thank you. Interesting point.
Time for one more, or no obligation if there isn't one more?
Several now.
Oh, they're leaping up.
In now, you see.
Go ahead. You were first. I think your hand was up first.
My name is Hao, and I'm from Vietnam. Yeah. Sorry, my voice. In the past, I worked for a project very similar to yours, the project funded by the UNDP.
Yes.
And to remove the opium trees in the border province, Vietnam, next to Laos.
That's Savannah Cat.
So, one of my concerns with this kind of project is about its impact. And as you mentioned here, the impact during the project period, 7 years, 2 million. I don't say about the value, but I mean, normally when the project is there, we can measure the impact. But after that, when the project finishes, seems to me that the impact is declining and even worse. In the case of the project I work for, after the project, and because when the project was there, the infrastructure was built, and after the project finished, it becomes worse because it becomes the excellent place for the drug traffic dealers. So that that makes that province even worse after the project. So in this case, I just wonder if you have had a look at the post-project impact or just the impact during the project.
So some of the data here in this second paragraph largely comes from a study that I went back to do in 2020. A colleague of mine went back to the ministry, and we went back out to the sites that we were working in, and by interviewing farmers, tried to estimate what what the economic impact in particular had been, and obviously that's quite a difficult calculation to make.
Yeah.
And we,
Sorry,
yeah.
I just want to add that in my case, 5 years after the project, the situation was worse.
yes, it was okay. I mean, it wasn't in this case, to the best of my knowledge, anyway. And I was mentioning in answer to Hillary's question, certainly, for sure, there was this huge region that's now developed and established and recognised by the authorities as a new crop, essentially a new commodity that's being produced there. So I was interested, though. You were looking at, was it opium crop replacement? Were you looking to help farmers replace?
We try to help farmers to develop the other type of products that they can cultivate, they can produce other than the opium trees.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not surprising then, is it?
And after 5 years, they come back to cultivating the opium years again, and that's a biggest place for drug traffic.
Yeah, I suspect that might be crop specific. Maybe. I don't know.
It's certainly a high value crop, isn't it, Al?
Well, that's the point. We weren't doing that. I mean, opium's such a fascinating.
Right, I'm going to let Charbel go in for a last question, because I am going to suggest that maybe if one person, I've just spotted that both our dropouts are from one session of the next 2 sessions. So if one person, I'm looking at the 3 of you, might be willing to move from 104 to 105, we would have 3 in each rather than 4 in each and 2 in another. And it's actually a longer session, so it would enable us to make an extra couple of minutes to conclude. So I'll leave you to ponder that, so that if one of you is willing to do it, I can announce it so that everybody knows where everybody's going to be. Charbel. Did I miss somebody?
Eric.
Oh, sorry, Eric. I didn't. Go ahead, Eric. So hoping that we've got space for these 2 questions now with my cunning organisational intervention. Eric and then Charbel.
It's just, okay, my name is Eric Kuta. I come from Kenya, and I was working at the Ministry of Agriculture, and there was someone like you. Exactly. Not you personally, but someone who had a long sabbatical from University of California, Davis, who came to work with us when I was working. I was just switching the sides. I was working at the Ministry of Agriculture, and we worked with that person. It was about extensions, agricultural extension, very similar to this. Yeah, just from my point of view, when I was there, we modified our behavior because of the presence of this person.
Yeah.
And then, after that, everything went back to how it was.
And do you know that Larson cartoon?
Yeah.
The anthropologist.
You transitioning to actually chairing the meeting is actually very interesting. And I remember even my boss, who was the director, subordinated himself in the presence of this person from University of California, Davis. The person was the boss when he came in. and everything changed.
Yeah.
I wonder how you could deal with those unintended consequences of your presence.
Sure. I mean, what I wouldn't want to do is overplay. I mean, because this sort of narrative voice is around my learning and my particular trajectory through this. I don't think it's that significant, really, in the broader scheme of things. I think it probably played a minor part in what transpired. But the really important thing was done because it was using participatory methods. The important actual work on the ground largely done by Laos professionals, not by Western advisors. That's with the exception of Michael, because he did actually do an awful lot of work with the fund. But it was clear that my colleague, he's now my doctoral student, kind of had the trust of people. That was just evident if you went out into the field with him, he got to know them and so on. I don't think I personally, I don't think it probably had a particularly major impact on direction. Occasionally, I think it did. You're right. I mean, those people in that meeting might have thought, oh, well, who's this jerk or whatever? I don't know. I mean, I did.
Smile and wave, boys. Smile and wave.
Indeed. Indeed. And it does remind me of the last cartoon. Well, if you don't know it, that it's the anthropologists are coming. It's a marvelous cartoon, in which they are hiding away their TV sets, are running out of the field, hiding stuff, hiding high tech. Anyway, so I think you make a very good point, and I understand the point you're making.
Okay, Chabel.
Thank you for your presentation. Just a question, because one of my projects is about, how communities, for example, in the Brazilian Amazon, they engage and start supply, for example, fruits or, supply chains, cosmetic supply chains, and how they, overcome like challenges and take advantage of opportunities. So would you suggest using leadership as practice as one of them?
Not really, necessarily. I mean, so this paper isn't really about the pragmatics. I'm not covering here the kind of project methodology. This is sort of an aside. It's kind of like based on my own field notes. So it's sort of, if you like, a more scholarly academic endeavour. And in that context, I think leadership as practice proved to be quite valuable, useful interpretatively. We weren't expressly dealing with concept of leadership here, although we did get interested in it, like as a group, and so we did do some investigation, but we didn't explicitly kind of do any kind of leadership development. Definitely not. The pragmatic methodology we used was participant action research.
Okay.
And that was I'm happy to talk about that, but it was a different methodology. So I'm not advocating LAP as a sort of practical project tool, although I suppose it might be. I mean, I don't know. You could experiment with it maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting anyway. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, right. First things first, let's thank Peter and the audience in the traditional way. Second thing second, have I managed to tempt Jane, Steve or Elena to move to the dark side of room 105 as opposed to 104? And if so, which one of you might it be?
I don't mind going, although we've just been set up.
Yes, I was aware of that as I said it. It just seems a bit foolish, doesn't it, if we've got 4 in one room and 2 in another at the same time. If one of you wants to, obviously let me know which, and so that we can let everybody else know where to go if they want to find that presentation. You're happy to go, Jane? You sure? Okay, so Jane is shifting from 105 to 104. Okay, thank you. Jane is shifting from 104 to 105. We'll now have 3 presentations.